This is Martin Forsberg speaking. I'm now going to go through the European norm specification, the European standard, and some of its content. I hope this will give you some shortcuts to important concepts, and that it will make it easy for you to read and understand this specification in the future. Let's see. So we've already seen the agenda. Ines presented it for us, so I'll skip that for now. We start with a few words from the directive and how the standard came to be. The background is said to be that we have many different standards in Europe of e-invoicing. We have domestic and industry-specific standards. There are several international standards being used. Few of them, or none of them, are contextualized to specific the European requirements, such as European VAT regulations and so on. So that's a lack of normative contextualized standard. There's been projects in CEN, the European Standardization Organization, for example, MAG and CEN BII, who has done this, but not on a very normative or formal level. The results have been called workshop agreements. So there's a lack of normative standards in this area. We also have different approaches and ambitions in the member states, and the directive on electronic invoicing and public procurement sets a minimum requirement for the public sector. It also says in the directive that the benefits of electronic invoicing are maximized when the generation, sending, transmission, reception, and processing of an invoice can be fully automated. And this also gives the conclusion that a mere image file cannot be considered to be an electronic invoice for the purpose of the directive. Should be structured and issued electronically. So the directive puts the requirement on the contracting authorities and entities. And if we look at Article 7, it says that the member states shall ensure that the contracting authorities and contracting entities receive and process electronic invoices. So they must stand ready to receive and process invoices which comply with the European standard on electronic invoicing and any of the syntaxes on a list. So the European standard, that's the semantic data model that we're going to talk about today. And the list of syntaxes are the formats that these the business terms can be represented in. So let's take a look on the definitions. So this is a bit of a crowded slide, but what it's trying to describe is that the electronic invoice is what's being exchanged between the buyer and the seller and their IT solutions, issued, transmitted, received, structured in a structured format. And the way the directive says that this should be done is that we should have a semantic data model of the core elements, all the business terms and the rules of an electronic invoice. These information entities, so these business terms, can be represented on a number of syntaxes. There are syntax bindings, so regardless of which syntax you use, it's the same semantics the same information being exchanged. So this is the concept of these specifications that we are now talking about. Normally, perhaps, in many e-invoicing implementations, the syntax and the semantics are very tightly bound or considered almost the same. But here it's more separated, and which would make it more long-lived and possible to also evolve the syntactic solutions over time. So, at the time when the directive was drafted and published, this standard didn't exist. So in the directive, it asked the Commission to request to the European standardization organizations to develop this standard. there are many standardization organizations in Europe, and the request went out to all of them. It was the request itself can be compared with a call for tender. For example, you state all the requirements and expectations that you have on the standard. For example, the requests from the Commission said that it should be based on you should take into account international e-invoicing standard formats. It should be based on existing e-invoicing models like MAG and BII. It should take into account related projects from European projects. There was a long list of specific requirements that should be taken into account to fulfill, and a number of other projects and works that should be regarded in the work for this standardization. So it's quite a demanding task. There was also an end date for when the standard should be published. So, daunting. It was CEN, the European Standardization Organization, who took this task in a committee called TC 434. It has over 100 committee members from 31 countries, and any participation in this work, which is ongoing, should be done through your national standardization organization. The committee is about to finalize all deliverables. It's only one specification still to be approved. And looking at the right of this slide, you can see a diagram which says that on a normative, the highest normative status you can get is a European standard or a European norm. And from CEN, the lowest normative status is a workshop agreement. So this is where we had CEN BII and MAG, the two data models. These were workshop agreements. On the other hand, the preparation time and the formal steps and everything, it takes more time, the higher normativity you want. So the semantic data model that we are talking about today is on the highest normative level. It's a European standard. Some of the other specifications coming out from TC 434 are technical specification or technical reports. So here is the list and the current status. I will not go into detail on this, but overview. The European standard is now approved. It's published. You can get it from your standardization organization. So is the list of syntaxes that comply with the European norm, and some other methodology specifications and reports. Also the syntax bindings to UBL, the XML format UBL, and cross-industry invoice. So these are the two syntaxes that are required according to the list, to the mandated list. There is also a syntax binding to EDIFACT, which is optional to implement for public entities. There's also a report on the result of a test that's been done. That is still work in progress and under approval now. So let's take a look at some key concepts of the standard. So you can now get, as I mentioned, the semantic model is possible to get from your standardization organization. I will get into a little bit more details on that in the end. If you open the first page in the standard, you will see the disposition, and we are now going to look a little bit on the concept of a core invoice, because we're using the word core invoice throughout the standard. We look at the business processes to support semantic model, rules, and data types, and a concept called core invoice user specification, and what it means and what it means with compliance with the standard. So first, this picture tries to illustrate where the e-invoicing standard affects you, and if we take first the steps in the process, that is relevant for your e-invoicing solutions. It needs to know what to expect, how to present, and what to do with an electronic invoice, depending on its function or what its type. The information being exchanged, so the business terms, that's relevant for everybody, including the users of the system. So this specification has relevance for the technical implementation, the syntaxes, the information to exchange, and also the users in the end, because here you will find the definition of the business terms and what rules and how to understand them. The technical format, syntax bindings, are relevant for the exchange of the information between the systems. The standard does not cover e-delivery or the transportation of messages. So neither the directive nor the standard is addressing this part of the e-invoicing solutions. Also, as I mentioned, the directive asks for a core invoice data model. So the core information elements, which are seen to be relevant for most. And the reasons for core invoice, and this is taken from the standard itself, it says that the business environment is diverse. And that also results in that the need for information exchange is diverse. And invoices from different situations may potentially contain many information elements. And if you want to capture all of these information or business terms used in all situations, you get a very, very large and complex model. And even if you would standardize that large and complex model, it would be very challenging and costly and complex to implement. And that would probably then lead to also that different industries or countries would implement subsets of this, and these may end up as silos where interoperability is hampered, and of course costs are generated. So this illustration should give you an impression of, this is an example from an e-invoicing standard. Of the invoice line. It's only the portion of information that the invoice line can contain. And if in my community we decide that only the red elements here, like the item information and tax and allowance and charges, for example, that's what we want to exchange. And within those available business terms, within those concepts, only a few business terms are relevant for us. And likelihood that other communities would choose exactly the same business terms is very small. So, and we're talking about these concepts of subsets and core, and traditionally we have many subset approaches of international standards, where over time a community builds a big subset of, for example, EDIFACT. And within that subset, the implementers develop their guides. There's really no common denominator here, only the outer boundaries. And the other way around was to develop a core, which was assumed that everybody should be able to support. And then you have the possibility to extend on that core instead. So you have something in common. This picture is a little bit muddled by the concept of user specifications, which opens up for possibility to restrict the core. We'll come back to that in the end of the presentation. But the idea is that the core should be small enough so that it can be implemented as is, more or less as is, instead of a huge outer boundary. You have a smaller mandatory or a smaller essential part. So the standard identifies a few guiding principles that was used also by the committee during the work to decide whether or not information requirements should be acceptable or not. And some of these very high-level guiding principles should be that it should be easier to use this e-invoice based on the core than using paper invoicing. And the idea that standardized information elements makes processing more efficient. It should be possible to use without prior consultation of bilateral agreements. That's an important part. So you shouldn't have to have a project where you define your specific requirements for every new onboarding of an e-invoicing relationship. It should contain information to enable efficient and automatic processing. So we need to have references to things like orders and order lines and so on. Software should be able to present all information and automatically process structured data. Structured data should result in optimized business processes, as said. The core invoice model should not make assumptions on the method of creation, delivery, or processing. So it should be independent of the infrastructure, so to speak. And the core invoice model should not make assumptions on the syntax or transmission technology. So how the work in the development of the standard is requirement-driven. We had the guiding principles I mentioned before. We have input from the committees, and when it's in this also the requirements from the Commission in the standardization request comes in, and from the directive and so on. But it's the committee members who had the responsibility to make sure that this was fulfilled. So input from committee members and the guiding principles resulted in a list of processes and functions that the standard should support. Based on these business processes, a list of requirements, business requirements, were identified. And based on this list of requirements, the model of the business terms were captured and the business rules governing the business terms. So this is the approach that the committee used to define the data model. Looking at the first step here, the list of processes and functions, the 12 processes defined. I'll not go through all of them, but things like invoicing of deliveries of goods and services against purchase orders based on a contract, which is a common business process for public entities. But we also have, like on the incidental, anyway, there are many typical business processes. These are the ones that were the ground for defining the list of requirements. It could be that other business processes may be supported, but they were not necessarily considered during the standardization work. So we have the business processes to support. From that, the business requirements were derived. So you see copied here from the standard R5, 6, and 7. These are identified with numbers. It says on a kind of high level that information to trace to a single related purchase order from the document level, all processes except P2 and P5. So you can follow here that this requirement comes from this and that process. So there's a possibility to trace back why something is in the standard. And what we see here is the actual data model. The business terms are not just listed in a list, they have also an internal structure, so they are organized in groups, or could say classes. And these have relationships to each other. So a seller may have a postal address and price details and item information and so on. To look at all the details and the definitions, I recommend you to get your hands on the standard itself. I will not dive into that detail level now. But it is essentially comparable to typical e-invoicing standards, content-wise, with what we have around Europe as it is. So content-wise, you can represent normal invoices with a pretty high degree of structured information. So looking at the business terms themselves, they are organized again with a business term ID. So you have an identifier, unique ID for each business term. In this listing, you have an indication of the depth in the model. So to make it easier to read the list, to see the relationship between like parents and children, business terms and groups. The cardinality indicates optionality and repetitions. So if something is 1.1, it means that minimum 1 occurrence and maximum 1 occurrence. So the invoice number must be present, but only 1 invoice number. It could be also 0.1. That means that 0 repetition is possible, but maximum 1. And it could also be repeatable. The business term itself is the name of the term in a language or in a way that a normal business user would understand it. If you look at the syntaxes and standards, technical standards, sometimes the business terms are foreign from what are used in business language. But here it's important to connect to the language used in the directive and to make it easy to understand. The description, again, is a definition or a description of the business term. It has a usage note which gives more guiding or explanatory information. So we also here can follow back to the business requirements for why this business term exists in the standard. So the requirement ID is a reference to this to the requirement. And finally, something called semantic data type. And semantic data types are, if you look at the box to the right, you have amounts, unit price amounts, quantity, percentage, identifier, document reference, code date, text, and binary objects. These are the semantic data types used. They, in themselves, are based on more primitive types, like string, decimal, date, and binary. The semantic data types are sometimes built up using supplementary components. And for example, if we look at the binary object to the left, we see it has its content. That is the content of a file, such as a PNG file. It has a MIME code saying which type of file it is, and a file name. So these are supplementary components or attributes for a binary object. And this goes for some of the semantic data types, that they have these supplementary components, not all of them. The business rules are very important. They are expressed as assertions. That means that a statement which should be true, like an invoice shall have an invoice number. So if you then look at an invoice and it has an invoice number, it follows this rule and it's true. So all the rules are defined like these types of assertions. And if you test an assertion against an invoice instance and it turns out that it's false, then you have broken a rule. We have different types of these rules. Integrity constraints. These are mandatory elements and rules against negative values. These are sometimes expressed as cardinality. You saw, for example, if something is optional or mandatory. The syntaxes, the XML formats, may or may not have the same restrictions built in already from the standard. It could be, for example, that the invoice number is a typical element which is mandatory both in UBL and cross-industry invoice. But there are other elements which are optional in the XML syntax, and then these business rules are important to be able to test that these extra restrictions coming from the semantic model are followed. And the way of testing these integrity constraints and also the conditions I'll come to next, you can use the schematron rules, which is a validation mechanism to actually, in runtime or when developing, evaluate each XML file that you create, whether or not it follows the rules of the standard. We have the integrity constraints. We also have conditions, dependencies between business terms. Those are not possible to see by just looking at the data model. So, I'll give you an example. Perhaps if the invoice contains VAT amounts, then the seller VAT number must also exist in the invoice. So there is a dependency between business terms spread out in various places in the semantic model. Also, these can be implemented through schematron rules, so it can be verified in that way. And the rules are normative. These are part of the definition of compliance to the standard. So it's not, the standard is not only the semantics of the business terms, it's also following these rules governing the business terms. And looking into detail of the business rules, you see also here they are uniquely identified. This is very useful. So you can, for example, when you validate something, you can see the identifier of that particular rule. And you can look it up in the standard and read more about it and get a better understanding, perhaps. You have the description, which is a natural language description of a rule. The target, it's the group of business terms or the place where the rule is relevant, and the pointer to the business term. So this is for integrity constraints. See. Conditions, similar. Looking at the first one, invoice line charge reason code and invoice line charge reason shall indicate the same type of charge reason. And they have also a different type of identifier. So you can see the conditions and the constraints by looking at how the identifier is constructed. You also see the last example there. Sum of invoice line net amount is equal to the invoice to the sum of invoice line net amount. So one business term should be the result of if you sum up other business terms. As a closing note on the business rules, this is probably something that might become the quality gets better in the implementations, and also it gets much easier to find errors when using this technology or using business rules in this structured manner. But sometimes, if you have a simple tool, or if the issuer has little control of the validity of its content, it can also be an investment to higher the quality of the issuing system. So it can be something it needs a lot of testing when going live, that you actually live up to the business rules. So we have the conditions and the constraints. There's also a few chapters on VAT rules, specifically grouped. Each VAT category mentioned in the standard or supported in the standard has its own set of business rules. So if you have, for example, zero-rated tax, or if you have exempt from VAT, or if it's standard VAT, you then have a set of separate business rules that must be followed in the instance. So that was the chapter on the semantic model and the business rules. I think the best way for you to, if you want to learn more, is to get your hands on the standard itself. I'll come back to how you find it, and read more about it there on the details. So I mentioned in the beginning the concept of a core invoice usage specification, sometimes referred as CIUS, core invoice usage specification. A CIUS allows for this, and it can be compared to an implementation guide of the standard. So a CIUS must be a true subset of the norm, meaning that it must follow all the business rules. It can't add any new concepts or terms that's not already in the standard. So a CIUS can be a very simple thing, like the seller in a community or within a trading relationship. You specify that the seller must provide a contract reference. That could be the simplest way of a CIUS. So that's an instruction on how you put a more restrictive rule on the standard itself. But it can also be more complex specifications to restrict cardinalities, to make subsets of code lists, or to limit the length of text elements. Anything that essentially restricts the standard. But it has to be true subsets, so you're not allowed to extend. And so what is allowed? Now, you can forbid the usage of optional elements. It's possible to make definition more narrow. You can add synonyms and explanatory text. You can make optional elements mandatory, as I mentioned with the contract reference. In many cases, for example, the invoice line, it hasn't an upper limitation in the number of repetitions that are allowed. It's unbounded, so you can have infinite minus one number of invoices of lines, essentially. That can be limited to like 999 or something like that. You can change the data types to a narrower representation. Alphanumeric can be numeric. Can limit the allowed code values. So if it's a code list of 200 available codes, you can limit it to 10 or 5 or whatever. You can add more business rules that makes the implementation more restrictive. And as I mentioned, field length can be restricted. Formatting can be specified. And number of decimal fractions can be restricted. So if you follow this guidance or these rules, all invoice instances, all invoice messages that's created following a CIUS will by definition always be compliant to the standard itself, because it's following the rules of the standard, but it's more restrictive. So that's an important thing. So invoices which follows the CIUS must always also be compliant towards the norm. If we look again at the directive and the requirements for the contracting authorities and entities, it says that the member states shall ensure that contracting authorities and contracting entities receive and process electronic invoices which comply with the European standard on electronic invoicing. So the recipient must receive and process those invoices that comply with the standard. So looking at the standard, what does it mean to comply with the standard? And there's a section in the standard saying that for a sending, or looking now at the receiving party, a receiving party may only claim compliance to the core invoice model if he accepts invoices that comply with the core invoice model in general, or with the SIAS that is self-compliant with the core invoice model. So this means the standard opens up, for example, for a country to create a restrictive version of the norm, and for the entities in that country to support only that SIAS. This is how it's defined in the norm. It can be discussed if this opens up for non-interoperable solutions or not, but this makes it possible to, for example, mandate some national or domestic legal requirements that are not well defined in the norm itself. So it has drawbacks and benefits, this possibility, but you should be aware of this possibly complicating factor. More can be read in Chapter 7 and Chapter 4 of the standard itself on this subject. So I mentioned a list of specifications in the beginning. We have the list of syntaxes that comply with the standard. It's a specification which is quite small, not that many pages. It lists. It says that UBL and cross-industry invoice are the mandatory syntaxes for the public entities in relation to the norm. It has a methodology for how to syntax bind the core elements of the electronic invoice towards syntaxes, and also separate specifications for the UBL syntax binding, cross-industry invoice syntax binding, and EDIFACT syntax binding. It has a guideline on interoperability of electronic invoices at the transmission level. It's not normative, as I mentioned before, the e-delivery part of the transmission part. This is just a guideline. It also has a guideline on the use of sector or country extensions in conjunction with the standard. So if you want, in your community, you want to use the core, but you need to extend on it, this is the methodology you should look at. This describes how you can add business terms to the norm. And also, I mentioned the report that has not yet been formally approved, but it's underway. The result of tests with respect to the standard's practical application for end users. So, where can you find the specifications? Standards from CEN, the European Standard Organizations, are published and distributed either through CEN directly or through the national standardization organizations. And if you go to CEN at the web page of CEN TC434, you can find a list of sales points. And this is perhaps, if you use two CEN standards, European standards, this is not a surprise to you perhaps, but if you're not been working with these before, it might come as a surprise that these standards has to be bought for a price. You can, by looking at, on this page, if you would click on the sales point, you can see the different countries where this standard can be purchased. It's worthwhile to actually compare a bit between the countries because the prices may vary. And to give you an indication, what I've seen, at least for the norm itself, the semantic data model, the prices varies between 25 euros up to around 200 euros, depending on where you look. So with that, I'm reached the last slide on my presentation, and I open up for question. I haven't followed the chat very closely, but do we have questions that have come in?
Thank you very much, Martin, for presenting. So far, we don't have any questions on the chat function, but now it's your time. So if you have any questions about what Martin just presented, or if you or about any other topic around the invoicing, this is your turn. So we are here to answer your questions. If you want, you can raise your hand again on the right side of your screen, so you can actually talk to us and for the questions instead of using the chat function if you prefer.